Good morning. My name is Stephen Frazier, and I am an engineer working for Koch OnPoint. And first of all, let me give thanks to Lionel and to Stefan. You guys are giving me this opportunity to present the results of a collaboration that I had on the topic of collider bias and understanding the statistics on racially based policing. Just a quick my background. I am if you've read my background, I'm a geek's geek in a way, and basically I graduated engineering a long time ago and been in manufacturing for more than 40 years, and I've manufactured just practically everything from bags to wood products to Cascade dishwashing detergent all the way through a variety of products. Bayesian analysis has afforded me the opportunity now to use these tools in my work, and I really enjoy using them. But getting back on topic here, what I like to do real quickly is just to give you just kind of what I like to do is to try to do a little brief education so that you understand how this topic of bias works in Bayesian networks and in terms of how we apply it to this situation, the topic I'm presenting today. We're going to review how Bayesian networks discover bias and then how they impact factors within the network. So the first simple example of this, and I don't is called Simpson's paradox. And this is an example that, I took from the Book of Why by Julia Pearl, but it's just a real simple, basic example of one of the first ways that bias can be discovered in a Bayesian network. So what we have here is we have a new drug that's being tested to reduce heart attacks. So we have a control group and the treatment group. We have a gender, females and males, and we're looking at heart attacks and then no heart attacks. So to begin to understand bias in Bayesian networks, you need to start with understanding the three simple connecting configurations that of which two of those you can use to observe bias. So in Bayesian networks, of course, you have a chain, right? Where you have a sequence of parent and child nodes. All right. Very simple connection. And then you have a fork, where you have a parent node that's feeding into two child nodes, a split, so to speak. And then you have a collider where you have a confluence of two or more parent nodes feeding into a child node. I would say that the collider and the first one going back are going to be where you probably see examples of bias. We're going to start with the chain configuration and show you where bias occurs in the Simpson's paradox here. So based upon the data that was presented here, you can construct this very simple three-node model where you have gender, 50-50 males and females. You have a drug that's either taken or not taken. And then you have the outcome of a heart attack. And based upon the data, 80% of the time you don't have heart attacks, 20% of the time you do. So this is your simple three-node model. When you analyze this model, the results by gender will suggest that really you see fewer heart attacks by not taking the drug. So if you look at, in this case, males, when the drug is taken, you have 40% chance of a heart attack. When the drug is not taken, you have a 30% chance of a heart attack. And when you observe females, you see a similar effect where when the drug is taken, you have a 7.5% chance of a heart attack. And when the drug is not taken, you have a 5% chance of a heart attack. So this is the beginning of what we see with Simpson's paradox. Now, here's the problem. The gender is a confounding variable. And what you'll notice is that its distribution changes depending upon whether the drug is taken. So at no point when we first observed a model, in this case, are you seeing gender being 50-50? And so the first thing you notice is that the drug now appears to show a benefit. Okay. When the drug is taken, you see that the probability of having a heart attack is 18%. And when the drug is not taken, the probability is 21%. But the challenge is if you didn't notice the shift in gender, you'd miss the paradox. And that's the problem. So when you balance gender to make it 50-50, then what you'll see is the true performance of the drug, which is in line with the earlier results that we showed for each gender separately. And so what you see here now is when the drug is taken, the probability of a heart attack is 24%. And when the drug is not taken, the probability of a heart attack is 17%. So now when you go back and rebalance the gender, you get the true effect of the drug. So this is an example of Simpson's paradox I wanted to start you with here. And the model really provides just a succinct way of depicting drugs performance in a gender balanced population. Now, collider bias occurs when you have two diagrams here. So we have collider bias, which is on the left, and you have Simpson's paradoxes on the right, we just talked about. In this case, what happens is when you instantiate on the collider, which is C, it can also change the base representation of the key variables A and B. So, in other words, contrasted to Simpson's, when you instantiate on C, you'll start seeing changes in A and B that you shouldn't see. And when in the case of the Simpsons paradox, where you instantiate on B, you see the A changes. And so that's again where the paradox shows up. So these are examples where you can observe the paradox and then realize that you've got a problem. So let's look at it in terms of what the study was. And let me give you some information, some history, how this thing evolved. So my experience in Bayesian networks is, I've been using two Bayesian network packages for model development, and the first BayesiaLab and another one I call it a GenaRisk. And I've worked with a GenaRisk since around 2014, in BayesiaLab since around 2017. So if you're not aware, Norman Fenton and Martin Neal are the creators of GenaRisk, and they were kind of like my initial educators on Bayesian networks. And I'd read some of Pearl's earlier books, but his latest, which I received last year at the conference and have since basically given away all my copies to everyone that I know, is probably one of the best books I've read. And both of this paper that you see on the left, it was written by Norman back in May. And this book, Julia's book, makes some references to collider bias. And Norman, he refers to it when the study of risk factors, and Pearl refers to it in when he talks about the Monty Hall model and Berkson's examples of Berkson's paradox. But what happened was after I read all this, I ran to this article. Now, and it was an article that appeared in 538 written by Laura Bronner. And the paper basically discusses how when you base evidence on police encounters, which she considers a collider, that can hide evidence of bias. So it was just a part of my morning reading. I ran into this article in 538 and I was like, wow, this is interesting. But in the way she presents it, she just presents it in this mathy sort of way, if you can see here. And if you recall, this is kind of very similar in a way to what my first class in BayesiaLab, when you're doing the beginner's class, when you're seeing Lionel make the presentation on particles and talking about how the properties of particles and how you can use those in terms of when building a model. So she really doesn't talk about Bayesian networks in the paper. But what she says is at the end, and I'm going to just read what her summary is, that the data seems to overwhelmingly point to a criminal justice system that's driven by racial bias. And she says, but more remarkably, it be even more overwhelming than some studies make it seem. And that's because of a statistical quirk called collider bias, kind of selection bias that means that crime data that shows racial bias is itself biased by racist practices. So let me go back and recap. I've been reading about collider bias, looking at papers and articles. I've had the book, started back in May of this year. Then I discovered the article in 538 and I decided just because of the coincidence of it, and I forwarded it to Norman and Martin at GenaRisk just to see what they would think about it. Then on July the 13th, I get this email, and I was kind of surprised that they had started a paper and they were listing me as a co-author because of, first I sent the article to them and we collaborated back and forth on this paper, making changes and talking about the models that they had designed and so forth. And so that happened in July of this year. And then on July the 17th, the paper was submitted for publication. So for me, it was a great experience to kind of work with them on this and to particularly a very important topic. I'll tell you one thing I've learned. You have to be very careful submitting articles to professors because you never know what they might do with them. But let's talk about the key point of the paper, just looking at the abstract. So she starts off with it. Contradictory conclusions have been made about whether Unarmed blacks are more likely to be shot by police than unarmed whites using the same data. And the problem is that by relying on data of police encounters, there's a possibility that genuine bias can be hidden. And then we provide a causal Bayesian network model to explain this bias, which is called collider bias or Berkson's paradox. And we show how the different conclusions arise from the same model and data. And we also show that causal Bayesian networks provide the ideal formalism for considering alternative hypotheses and explanations of bias. So, what Laura had presented in her paper, this basically, we took it and converted it into this simple Bayesian network model where you have race, contraband, stop by police, and the use of force. So, I'll talk about these features. Race, obviously, is white and black. Contraband is the reason why you're stopped. So, broken tail light, made a left turn, suspicion, or whatever, but that's the reason why the police would stop you to begin with. And what we did in the model, according to the paper that Laura had put together, was we assumed the probability of contraband is 20% for both whites and blacks. No difference. And then we said that if the contraband is true, the probability of being stopped by police is 50%. It's the same. But then here we added some bias on the next bullet. However, for whites without contraband, the probability of being stopped is 15 and 40, about 37.5%. And then for blacks without contraband, the probability of being stopped is 25 and 40, which is like 62%. So here we added some bias based on the stops. And then with the use of force, we said there is a 0% probability of the use of force if a person is not stopped by police, whether they're white or black and do not have contraband. So there's no probability of force there. But what we said is there is a 20% probability of force for any person stopped with contraband, regardless, white or black. But again, we added an additional bullet where we throw in some bias right here. However, we said there is a 4 in 15 probability or a 26% probability of force against a white person stopped without contraband, as compared to an 8 in 25 or a 32% probability of force against a black person stopped without contraband. So we've added bias in two locations here, one with the use of force and one with stops. Now, if you look at the marginal probability in the network model on the left, you can see that there's no evidence. You see no evidence of bias. Basically, race is balanced. So contraband 80-20, stop by police 50-50, use of force is 80-20. But on the right, you can see where the hid bias in the model starts to display itself. So you can see the increased use of force on blacks, which is 24% versus 16%. And also you can see the increased number of stops where it is 60-40. So that is what the model displays in terms of bias. Here's where this is what happens. So now if you're just looking at stops, so if you set the collider on stop by police to true, then, and you look at it for white, you'll see that basically the use of force is 60-40. And you also see it's exactly the same, 60-40 again for blacks. So obviously it shows the same level of force being applied to both when you look at it by basically setting the collider to stopped. You also notice that I've hidden out the contraband because there's a change there we'll discuss in a minute. But if you only look at use of force when stopped by police, the first thing you're going to miss now is that race is no longer 50-50. So if you look at the marginal model on the left, race is 50-50. If you look at the model on the right, where you look at stops being true, you now see that the race is 60% of the time black and 40% white. So basically what you're saying is to achieve the same use of force, which is the 60-40 that you see in the bottom box, You're basically stopping blacks at a higher rate. So there's your first problem. The other problem is when you look at contraband. So because 6 and 10 tops are for blacks and 4 and 10 stops are for whites, you'll notice that less contraband is found for blacks versus white. So if you look at it, contraband is true when the race is white 25% of the time. Contraband is true with blacks 16 or 17% of the time. So the problem here is that the excessive stoppage for blacks is not only it's less efficient because the basis for the stop, contraband, is not effective. You don't have a reason to stop. And ultimately, it has the potential to be what I call antagonistically criminalizing. In other words, people are angry because they're being stopped for no reason whatsoever. So the problem when you're just looking at police encounters, which is basically looking at stops, it creates a collider bias. And that if you report it that way, it'll appear to be that there's no problem when there really could be a problem. And ultimately, only the way you can only examine the model by looking at the ground truth. In other words, if you look at it for each group separately. So in this case, if we just look at race on the white on the left and black on the right, you can see the differences in the models and in the performance. Stops by police are higher with blacks, and use of force on blacks is higher than whites. Now, there are alternative models. And so we're not saying that's the only way to model things. The nice thing about Bayesian networks is that, you have this simple synthesis, graphical synthesis of a complex problem. And you can create a variety of models, of competing models to which you can test out different hypotheses. And so you can put in different assumptions or beliefs that you can use to help explain maybe what to help explain the data generating mechanism. And then also you can social arguments can be made testable by empirical means. So you can basically test out arguments in the model so that you can see if they hold, if the model or predicts arguments or sustains arguments or beliefs that you might have. So I just wanted to thank you for your time today and kind of the opportunity to present this paper and the results. I hope you found this informative. It was, like I said, it was a great experience for me, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to work with Norman, with Martin, and have the opportunity to present this to you at the conference today.